I just want to kind of expand out a bit and think about what we're trying to achieve here, what we're trying to do in having this discussion, and what you as organisations are trying to do. England, Britain, the United Kingdom has got one of the most subtle, sophisticated, multi-layered civic societies in the world. We are phenomenally lucky to have that inheritance here. It's something that kind of strikes me as I travel, especially around the Middle East recently actually, of how difficult it is for these emerging democracies tentatively trying to establish themselves, and how if you're trying to plant that seed in ground which is not used to having the richness of civic society that we have here, of just how hard it is to set up democratic institutions. You know, the two sit very closely together. And that is both a good and a bad thing. It's as far as our communities are concerned, it's good because it gives us the kind of breadth and richness of community activism that we have in this country. But it also makes it a very complex and sometimes forbidding environment for people who are newly arrived, whether it's they or their parents or their families are newly arrived, to try and enter that society and to influence it, to become part of it, and to become eventually integrated and enmeshed. And that is what we're trying to tackle in this conference. And I've heard so much today which I learned, and I want to say especially how useful it was to hear from Stephen, because his work at the Sutton Foundation has been transformational. And just to say something, he's far too modest to explain. It shows you how quickly evolving this sector is. When the Sutton Foundation was set up, there were many people in Sutton who said it wasn't necessary. There are many people who said we've got plenty of enough charities, we don't need another one kind of organising the world. And actually now, it's relatively young, what are we, 10 years old?
No, 9 in July.
9 at the end of July. People couldn't really imagine the charitable landscape in Suffolk without the Sutton Foundation. So if you feel that you're kind of up against a behemoth, be aware that it changes quickly, even in Suffolk, and be aware that it can change positively in your direction if you're willing to influence it. But I want to start on good news in a sense, because if we were having this discussion 20 years ago, it would have been very different. And we must pat ourselves on the back, I think, as a society and as a community, for the progress that has been made. There was magnificent news out this morning that for the first time since the pay gap between men and women was starting to be measured, that it has now vanished for under 40s for the first time since that data was collected. In fact, women under 30 are now earning, on average, very, very slightly more than men in similar positions. And it shows that one of the great campaigns which have been led by the standard bearers of people seeking equal opportunities, it can take decades to fight, but progress does happen, even those which seem almost impossible, and did feel impossible, I imagine, to those in the 60s and 70s that started them on equal pay. They thought that day would be a long way off. And it has been a long way off, but it is coming. There's much more to do. But who would have thought? I was having a discussion with a great friend of mine who was one of the founder members of Stonewall about 2 weeks ago. He said when they were setting up Stonewall, gay rights organisation, they could not have believed that in the period of time that has elapsed since they set it up, that they would have not only gay adoption and civil partnership, but now gay marriage. And even if we look back ourselves 10 years ago, if someone had said to us 10 years ago that there would have been gay marriage in 10 years' time, I don't think many people would have believed that statement. And yet it's happened. And it's moved quickly because of, I think, an innate ability within all the communities of Britain to be able to accept social change. There is an innate liberalism, I think, in this country, but also because of the great activism of so many community leaders. And so also with what was rather kind of oddly and awkwardly called race relations in the 70s and 80s, and the fact that phrase isn't used so much tells you that we have made huge progress. And this is where, I think we should always start a conversation when we're talking about integration and about influence in society, say that we've come a long way. And unless we actually make that statement right at the beginning, we're not giving the encouragement and hope ourselves to try and make further progress. Two figures which I think are kind of quite striking. That a quarter of all marriages now in London are mixed. That's an extraordinary statistic, I think, and quite a remarkable one, and no doubt will spread, that kind of statistic will spread out across the rest of the country in time, as do most things out of London. But also, I remember about 2 weeks ago, the latest results from the Social Attitude Survey, which measure what people think about big social issues over time. And it's been going on for many decades, so it's got a very, very consistent database. And whereas 30 or 40 years ago, if you asked people what they would think if their son or daughter married someone of a different colour, there was then a majority that said they would feel awkward about it. That figure now has reduced to almost single figures. Now, that shows progress of a different kind. And I think it's important, as I say, to accept it before we go on to make comments about how much more we have to do. I think we are at a point of inflection. The old days, when groups identified either by colour or by ethnicity or national background would come and apply for block grant funding from public bodies, are gone. They are gone because, on a simple matter of fact, there is less money to go around. And that is affecting the whole way that the public sector is doing business. And you heard that from Deborah earlier. There is a much more subtle funding landscape and complex funding landscape than there was previously. And secondly, it's a mark of the degree to which integration is happening. That exactly as Modulus made the point, that organisations like his are not serving just one particular ethnic group. They are providing services to a whole different swathe of people. And therefore it's more about the outcomes of what organisations are trying to offer, rather than the particular interests that they might once have done. And that, I think, whilst challenging, can also be something we should welcome, because it is a measure in itself of a degree of integration which was not the case 30, 40 years ago. I also think it shows something that's about the maturation of public policy itself. You know, there was a time when councils felt they could discharge their responsibility to minority groups just by throwing money at organisations. They could say, right, we know we've got an issue with Group X, and rather lazily they would say, if I come and chuck 10,000 quid at the self-proclaimed community leadership charity that is representing that organisation, then I don't need to worry about it anymore. Now, that is not a very grown-up way to try and help people who are in a disadvantaged position. And at its worst, frankly, it turned into political corruption. It turned to the point where people felt that they could buy off communities as a whole by throwing money at them. And that also is not a very good way to try and encourage integration, but also to deal with the ingrained and pervasive problems which face incoming community groups. And I'm glad, therefore, that we are probably coming to the end of that expectation of grant funding. It's going to be far more outcomes-based. It's going to be, whether we like it or not, around the service that is provided, to whom, and proving at the end of it that the results are working. And that is much better for all of us, both for the people who are paying for the service, taxpayers in the end, and donors, but also, and most importantly, for those people who are receiving. And what does that mean, therefore, for people who want to seek funding to do what they want to do to help their community as a whole? Well, to kind of bastardise JFK is a case of not, ask not what funding pot you can go after, but what you can do for your community, and then building a business case around it.